All right, so we're just going to give this about 20 to 30 seconds while all of our attendees get into the meeting. Hope everybody's having a fantastic Tuesday morning.
It is.
Here in Kentucky, it is absolutely beautiful this week. It's like mid to high 60s and sunny, and it's very hard being inside on a day like this.
The sun's just about to come up here.
Oh yeah, you're Pacific time, right? You in California?
Yeah, right.
Okay, so it looks like everybody is in. So we will go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to Whitmix's webinar, How to Establish an Anatomy Standard for the Dental Laboratory. And I'm joined by Jim Mahan of PTC. Any of you dental lab folks are probably very, very familiar with PTC. My name is Bryce Hiller. I'm the digital marketing specialist for Whitmix, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. I'd like to begin with a few housekeeping items. First, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you should see a questions box. Feel free to type in any questions throughout the webinar, and Jim will be answering those more than likely at the end, or we may pop in and ask him during the webinar if it's relevant to what we're talking about at the time. Next, if you are a CDT, this webinar is approved for 1 hour of CE credit toward your certification. You'll receive an email within 1 to 2 days that will tell you how to obtain your credit. So be on the lookout for that email. And also, this webinar is being recorded. So we are actually live on Facebook. And within 48 hours, this recording will be on our Whitmix website. And it will also be available on our Facebook page. So now I'd like to introduce Jim Mahan, CDT, who is the president and CEO of PTC, that's Productivity Training Corporation. As PTC's principal trainer for over 2 decades, he has trained hundreds of laboratory technicians in dental technology. As a consultant for Nest Consulting International, he has trained technicians, managers, and owners from around the world. He draws on 40 years of experience as a dental technician, manager, and lab owner to help laboratory owners develop training programs and to establish better control of their business. With that, I am very happy to introduce Jim Mahan.
Thanks very much, Bryce. You know, every time I hear that has 40 years of experience, it causes a little reflection. You know, it's like, that's a long time. I want to take a minute to just acknowledge Whitmix for putting on these webinars. You know, it's a fantastic thing that they do without really thinking about much about what they're going to benefit from it. I frequently tune in whenever, you know, there's an interesting subject, and I've mentioned it before to even Bernie that, you know, it's a real credit to Whitmix that they do this just purely for the enhancement of their customers. So this thing that we're talking about, creating anatomy standard for the laboratory, is an elusive thing. I do a lot of seminars, you know, for the last 20 years I've been with PTC, and I do about a seminar about once a month, and we do some consulting. And one of the things that I always start with whenever a laboratory wants training is I'll say, so what's your anatomy standard? And I would say probably 90% of the time, the answer that comes back is, well, what do you mean? And I say, you know, anatomy standard, what do you use in your laboratory to establish this is how we do our anatomy, this is how we contour. And some labs will say, well, you know, we have the PTC teeth, you know, they look like this, and that's what we use. And I say, okay, so how do you use those? Well, you know, we have, you know, when somebody comes on board, we teach them the anatomy and we show them the teeth, and we say, well, you know, when you make your crowns, we want them to look something like this. I say, okay, well, that's something, it's good. And who enforces that standard that you're establishing? And the answer usually is, well, Bob's our QC guy, or Marianne, and she's the one that holds that in place. So, and I'll say, so what you're saying is that the standard of the laboratory is really held by Bob or Marianne or whoever happens to be QC at the time. And they'll go, well, yeah, I guess so. And then it goes on from there. And obviously, just by what I'm saying is that you can see that the standard of the laboratory, whether it's a quality standard or whatever it is that you're using, can't really be held by one person. That person's gone for the day, they quit, somebody else comes in, doctor calls, 5 doctors call and say my contacts are too tight. The standard changes from that point forward. So it's really an issue. And so when we talk about a standard, we have to be very, very specific. Now I'm going to start this program with a number of word definitions. Now these things, when you get into word definitions, it's like, okay, yeah, fine, let's get into the real meat of it. But what I'm going to tell you is these word definitions are more than definitions, they're concepts. And the concepts, when you connect them together, really is what creates the mindset to be able to create a standard. So before we get started, here is a PTC tech sheet that we use on all of our seminars and all of our training. Now, there's a download here, a link to download that. Anybody, if you want to download it now and practice while we're doing it, because ultimately we're going to learn how to draw these teeth and create an anatomy standard through the ability to draw. If you don't want to leave the program, you can do it. You can do it at a later time, but it's there for you anytime you want to use it. And by the way, at the beginning of every seminar, I hand these out and I give them to the people in the seminar. And I say, before we start, just do these drawings. And of course, the look on their faces is like fear. I'm not an artist. And I say, all you have to do to draw a tooth is be able to draw a curved line. You just have to know where they go. And so when we get those back, virtually none of them are correct. None of them are accurate. And there's a lot of variability. And it's really especially interesting when we have 2 people from the same laboratory draw them, because they're never even close to the same. So let's get started with this thing. And the first word we're going to talk about is fundamental. Everybody knows what a fundamental is. If you ask them, do you know what a fundamental is? Sure, and then I'll say, well, what is it? And the answer comes back, well, it's a basic. And I say, oh, good, that's right. Now, so what is a basic? Well, it's fundamental. And so there we go. So the definition that I like best of a fundamental, and it really is what we base a lot of the PTC technology on, is an original generating force, being the one thing from which others are derived. So by itself, it's okay, that's fine. But what does it really mean? An original generating force. That means the beginning of something, and it has some type of influence. It has some type of force. But this rest of it the part says being the one thing from which others are derived. That's where the whole thing comes in of, well, if I know the one thing from which everything else that I'm doing arrives from, if I improve that, wouldn't that mean that whatever it is that I'm doing would be improved? I mean, I always like to use the example of, let's say, Tiger Woods. I heard one time that Tiger sometimes hits 1,000 balls in a day. Well, he's standing up there, swing, 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 1,000 times. So what's the point of that? Well, we understand that pro golfer might have 16 clubs in his bag. It's not the clubs, it's the swing that counts. It's the fundamental part of, if he learns to be able to create a swing that's exactly perfect every single time, then when they change the club, based on the club is determining what they want the ball to do, then you end up with somebody who is perhaps a better golfer. It happens throughout everything. All the greatest coaches in history always stress the fundamentals. In dental technology, we have a problem with that because we don't know what the fundamentals are. How do you practice a fundamental if you don't know the original generating force, where that thing comes from? What I like to say in a course like this is that we make teeth as dental technicians. And so if we are thinking about, so what's necessary if we're going to make teeth, it has to come down to anatomy. We really have to know anatomy, and we have to know it well. Where do you learn anatomy as a dental technician? You learn it from somebody in the lab, you went to lab school, you took an anatomy course, you got 80%, and you moved on, and the rest of the 2 years was something else other than anatomy. So that can be a problem. Just take a look at this other graph here. What I have here is that where would you place yourself or your technicians on this scale of knowledge of anatomy? Now, I'm going to refer to this scale throughout this course because it's really important to have an actual judgment of where you're located on some of these things, even based on what your understanding is and so forth. From my experience, if I have a technician put themselves on this scale, 0 to infinity. Now it's 0 to infinity because knowledge is such a broad subject, but it could be 0 to 10, could be 0 to 100. Nevertheless, if you place yourself on this scale of how well you personally know anatomy, where would that be? Would it be, an inch up from 0, or would it be in the middle? It's hard to say, but it is a scale that really starts to position people in their position of what they know about something. So let's take a look at this other reference, stable reference. Stable, resistant to change, firm and dependable. Okay, the thing about that is that a stable reference doesn't change. It's the same all the time. You could always depend on it. The reference part, a source of information, well, we already know that, we understand that. But this second sentence here, an indicator that orients you. I always have to explain this word orient. It means it tells you where you are at any given time. So I have a reference that is always going to be pretty much the same. And when I use that reference, it orients me. This particularly relates to, I have the knowledge of what anatomy is. Now I have to have a process by which I can create it. So in that process, these typically are step-by-step steps that you take. And if you're on step 3, then you know that you've completed step 2. I'm doing step 3, and the next thing is step 4. And it really turns out to be very clear. Now this becomes a bigger, more important thing as time goes on. Next one is objective. You have to want to do something. You're on this webinar because you have an interest in establishing a standard in your laboratory for anatomy. Okay, so many times that's how far it goes. When I go into in consulting, a lot of times the owner will say, well, we really want to establish some standards in the lab so we have more control. And of course, my question then comes, well, so what is your expectation of establishing a standard? And they never know. I mean, the standard for anybody is, we want everybody to be on the same page. And so this objective is good, and you have to have one to start out with, but it's often not something that causes you to go into action. Clearly defined objective is almost where all of us live in the dental laboratory. This is where we think from. It's a goal intended to be obtained without question. That would mean I'm sitting here and I'm doing my work. I know what I'm doing. I know where I am on the case, and I know what I want to happen. That basically is the result of that is a case that is good enough. It satisfies the doctors, satisfies the QC person. And so the case goes out and everybody is happy, basically. But remember what I said, it satisfies, it's good enough. There's nothing in there that says that it's excellent or exceeds expectation. Clearly defined objective really, when you have those things, you know what you're going to do, and it's very clear to you. But usually it results in, and sometimes it's risky to say, but usually it results in mediocrity. This word here, this concept here, precisely defined objective, is at an entirely different level of thought, I would say. It's a goal intended to be obtained by perfect conformity to fact or truth, sharply exact. It's almost like, a razor blade. Now, these objectives, I think of them in three different terms. An objective just by itself is like a searchlight in the sky. A clearly defined objective is more like a flashlight. It's more focused and it shows a particular area. Precisely defined objective would be more like a laser beam. It's exact and precise, and when you shine it on something, that's all you see. That's the thing that's really key. So almost no one lives in this area because it's a relatively unknown thing. Now, when we do our regular presentation on this, we show a different slide and about waxing a crown, and all of the materials of waxing a crown are on there. And we take each one by one and say, why would you use this? What if is this tip right? Is that tip right? Whatever. And so you can drill down into whatever process you're using to a precisely defined objective. At that point, that's as good as you're going to get. You've improved it as far as you can go. It's a key concept. Now we come into this whole thing of standards. A standard, I'm going to show you three definitions. A means of determining what a thing should be and may apply to anything used as a test of quality. So that's a little vague. A means of determining what it should be, and it might apply to quality. When you think about that, who does that, or how does that apply in your laboratory if you apply this standard? It really is applied by the QC person. They're the means of determining what that crown should look like, and they determine they apply their opinion as a test of quality. So we have the QC person applying their opinion of whether this is right or wrong, and they take it back. And it's not really based on particular truth or particular laws or particular rules that you have. It's based on whether Bob or Marianne thinks that this is going to satisfy the doctor that it was made for. That may not be the best way to determine a standard. There's another one that goes a little bit higher level. It's a definite level or degree of quality that's proper and adequate for a specific purpose. That seems like it would be a better definition to use for the standard that I'm applying in my laboratory. And actually, this standard is applied in almost every laboratory, because if you change this word, purpose, to dentist, then you have something else. A definite level or degree of quality that's proper and adequate for a specific dentist. We know that the doctor is always right. The doctor gives us a list of requirements. The doctor says, I want my contacts broad, I want them out of occlusion. And so that's what we do. So in many labs, if not most labs, the doctor establishes the laboratory standard for quality. You just have to please the doctor. There's another definition here that seems maybe even softer. Substantially uniform, well established by usage, and widely recognized as acceptable. Who or what type of company would apply that standard? Typically, we're going to find that standard in almost every franchise company that you see. Let's use McDonald's for an example. Substantially uniform. If you go to China, you go to the Middle East, you go to Europe, you go to Arkansas, that hamburger that you order is going to be, for all general purposes, the same one. It's going to look the same. It's going to taste the same. It's substantially uniform. McDonald's has established the quality standard for that hamburger. They've established a quality standard for their entire organization. You even have to go to McDonald University if you're going to own a McDonald's, because you need to know the standard and how to apply it. This other part, well established by usage. They sell billions of hamburgers. So obviously, this substantially uniform must have some value. But when we get down to this, widely recognized as acceptable, okay, so does anybody say McDonald's? Well, maybe some people do, but typically you don't think of McDonald's hamburger as being the best hamburger you ever ate, but you buy them anyway. And sometimes you have a craving for them, and you always know when you go there, they're going to be the same. And so McDonald's makes a lot of money. Could this also apply to a laboratory whose standard is exceptional, who is excellent, who is above the norm? Well, this substantially uniform could apply to that. It's above the norm. If we go back to the McDonald's example, you know, have you ever gone to a McDonald's and ordered a fish sandwich and the fish patty is halfway off the bun and the tartar sauce is dropping into your lap and the cheese isn't even on the sandwich? Of course you have. That's the substantially uniform that's not being held in place. In another McDonald's, let's say you go there and you can always depend on everything being exactly like what you think it's supposed to be. We determine that to be quality. You know, the sandwich might not be the best in the world, but the quality of the presentation and what we're expecting is exactly what we expect to get. This is the standard that we're trying to achieve with, in the case of what we're talking about here, with establishing an anatomy standard. Technicians that have an anatomical standard objective and a standard operating procedure to achieve it know where they are in the procedure and know exactly what the next step is and what the finished product should be. If you have a technician sitting at your bench, they have an exact idea of what the objective is, and they have a step-by-step procedure to achieve it. You have a power technician. You have someone who always knows where they are in the process, always knows what's going to be next, and they're productive. So they produce a quality product and they produce a lot of it. This thing that we talk about, well, you know, if you want me to go faster, don't expect too much. If you want higher quality, then I'm not going to be able to produce quite as much. Really comes out of this concept here, is that when we ask somebody to do that does not have an anatomical objective and a standard operating procedure, what they're telling you is probably correct. But if they do, it's not the same. Can you imagine how much creative energy and time is wasted trying to achieve a level of quality that's not clearly defined? This is something that we all need to think about as owners or even individuals, technicians. If you don't know exactly what you're supposed to do, if you don't know what Bob or Marianne at QC, if they're going to change every single day, you're always in a position of second guessing. You don't have something that you can count on that says, if I do it like this, I know I'm going to be right. That, in essence, is the whole purpose of establishing a standard. The certainty of the anatomical standards and operating procedures to achieve them are the foundation for sound technical opinion and good technical judgment. What we're going to do very quickly is we're going to start this process of going through how to draw posterior anatomy, how to place the individual pieces and parts of a tooth into the proper position. If a technician knows that, and a technician knows that it applies to maybe a stable reference that they have like this, and they have a procedure to get to it, that's only one thing. I'm going to teach somebody, even in our waxing courses, I teach them to wax one tooth and one tooth only. But I teach them every single thing they need to know about it. It's basically a standard procedure for how you carve a tooth or how you build a tooth for that matter. When they see a tooth that's not like that, it's very simple for them to say, everything is the same here except this one or two things. And so I already know what I'm going to do on how to fix that and how to change that. So consequently, a technician that's been trained with a solid technical standard and a technical procedure then really doesn't encounter difficult cases very much. So first statement we're going to use in drawing this tooth is the central dissectional groove is parallel to a line drawn through the buccal cusp tips and divides the tooth buccolingually. So I'm really fond of just doing the drawing so people can see it. So I'm going to use these pins and draw these lines here. This is a line as best I can using my Trek pad drawn through the buccal cusp tips. Now I want to divide this tooth in half and make a guideline that's parallel to that line. Those of you who have maybe downloaded that other tech sheet can go along with that. Okay, so now why would I do that? There is a concept here that pits are the fundamental concept of a tooth. If you get the pits in the right place, there is a really good chance that everything else will be in the right place. But there's an unknown here, unless you have an opposing that you're going to tap on, and maybe it shows you where the opposing teeth are, and you say, okay, well, the pits are here. How do you know exactly where the pits are located? What we're doing here in these drawings is creating for you a standard, stable reference. This is not every tooth, but based on the parameters that I'm going to give you, you'll be able to see that by measuring everything, we're going to be able to create a very acceptable looking tooth. Okay, so this would be our diagram that shows you how it looks. Mesial and distal pits are placed on the line 45 degrees from the beginning or the end of the marginal ridge. How do we know where the marginal ridge begins for people who are new to dental technology? Is that you can see where the buccal curves around, and there becomes a straight surface here. And right where that change comes in, right there is where we're going to find the beginning or the end of the marginal ridge. I'm going to go from that point right there, 45 degrees in, 45 degrees in from here, start where the flat part is and go 45 degrees in. That's where my mesial and distal pits are going to be. Right there. People always say when we're drawing, how do you know how far to put the pit in? That's how far you know how to put the pit in. So let's take a look. That's where they go. Now, if you have your pits in the right place, because this angle that you make, this 45 degrees, it also goes the other direction. And notice this creates a 90-degree angle right here. 90-degree angle right here. That's a good indicator. Now, does that always have to be exactly 90 degrees? I would say if you're teaching it, if you're drawing it, and you're trying to create a standard, the answer is yes. When you're actually doing an actual tooth, it might be 35 degrees, it might be 100 degrees. But typically, this is how we draw it. So where do the other pits go? Well, the buccolingual grooves stop just short of that central groove guideline. So if I know I have a buccal groove, I can come in here with this buccal groove. That's going to do it. I needed to. And stop just short of the guideline. This is where my pit's going to be. So I can place a pit here just off of the guideline, and I can place a pit here just off of the guideline. Now, these pits basically are equidistant from that guideline. I made this one a little bit further off, but they're equidistant from the guidelines. So now you can see I can go from drawing here up through this distal pit, down through the lingual groove, up through the buccal groove, out the mesial pit, and out. See what that looks like here. So let's draw the central dissectional groove just by connecting the dots. Draw that buccal groove by connecting the dots and the lingual groove. What we have now is primary anatomy. Secondary grooves, after the primary anatomy, well, primary anatomy just separates the tooth into cusps. In the case of this tooth has 4 clearly distinguished cusps. Secondary grooves are in the form of an elongated S, and they originate in the pits and placed on one side of an occlusal ridge. It's kind of surprising that some people have a difficult time making an elongated S. An elongated S looks something like this. So you can't see that as well on that black background. I should be using a white, but on the tooth, it doesn't show up quite well. So we're going to make elongated S. We're going to make one here, here, here on each side. So there's 2 kinds of secondary grooves. Marginal ridge grooves and cusp ridge grooves. Obvious, marginal ridge grooves form one side of the marginal ridge. And I'm going to do that for you right here. In the form of an elongated S. Now, when you think about where I'm going to put that marginal ridge groove, where do you think it goes? It goes 45 degrees back to where you decided that you were going to establish your pit. I can establish this marginal ridge groove here, elongated S over here. And typically I'm going to have that fairly close to 90 degrees, be even closer if I wasn't doing it with my mouse pad. So there's the marginal ridge grooves, and you can see it looks just like that. Now, so far, everything that we've done has been measured. We've used a guideline for everything, and we're using angles and positions of the pits just slightly off of the central groove. Now, when I say slightly off here of the central groove, how far off? Well, how big is the tooth? This is a big tooth. It's probably, the center of that is probably 4 millimeters, 3.5, 4 millimeters away. If your tooth is 1/10 the size, you could see what that would be. So the concept here is it does not touch the line. So in order to determine where the other grooves go, the crest of the ridge, the crest of each ridge extends from midway between the cusp tip and 2 adjacent pits. These adjacent pits either have to be on the line or in the direction of on the side that the cusp ridge is on. Now, the reason that we do this is that when we're establishing a standard and a stable reference, a precisely defined objective is extremely important. That could have been over just a little bit. This tooth, we're using as an example, is the one exception that we cross over the line. There's a ridge here on this tooth, and obviously we can't cross over that ridge to get to this pit. It wouldn't make sense. So in this case, we come from this pit that comes across the line and make the secondary groove. So this crest of the ridge is going to meet the opposing ridge crest. This one here is really quite simple, from in between 2 adjacent pits. There we go. Now we have, this is one side of the cusp ridge, this is the other side of the cusp ridge. See what that looks like. So now that I know where the top of the ridge is, I know that this groove over here is the bottom of the ridge. It's the bottom of the slope of the ridge. It's the lowest part. And that applies everywhere. This groove is the lowest part. So if I'm working on this plane, this is the top of the ridge, and this is the lowest part of the ridge. I want to place a secondary groove right in the middle of these ridges. That's my stable reference. That's what I'm going to use as my standard. And so I'm going to place a dot right in between those two. That's a guideline that tells me where my cusp tip or where my secondary groove is going to end up, just short of the occlusal perimeter. Now, when we're teaching this, of course, this is what we have to do to get precision. When you're carving it, or when you're building it, or when you're designing it as a designer, you're probably not going to do that, but this is necessary. So now that we have those, we know that secondary groove always starts in the pit. It's in the form of an elongated S, and it lies on one side of an occlusal ridge. So I can draw that secondary groove just like that. This one just like this. Now, what I could tell you is that what you see right here on this cusp is basically 90% of everything you need to know about how to draw a tooth, how to build a tooth, how to carve a tooth. The information is fundamental in that section right there, because I'm going to repeat the exact same thing here. Elongated S, start in the pit and go to midway between the cusp ridge and the adjacent groove. Same thing here. So this is just a repetition of the same thing. That's where the secondary grooves go. Now, what's the value in this? The value becomes, if I'm asking someone to draw a tooth, I can expect that the tooth that they draw based on our anatomy standard will look precisely like this tooth if they're using our format, precisely like this tooth. And so when I QC it, my opinion and judgment is simply based on whether or not that cusp that ridge is in this place, and this secondary groove is exactly in between the cusp ridge and the adjacent groove. I don't have to have, when I'm talking to a student, I don't have to have, or a technician, I don't have to say, well, I think it should be this way or that way, is that I know it should be there. There's no question of whether or not you've really conformed to the standard that we've established. And herein lies the key to everything that you really want to know whenever you're in your laboratory and when you're going through, let's say your new people come in and you're teaching an anatomy course. How far do you need to go? Okay, well, that's good enough. Good enough cannot be and should not be good enough in training. Good enough is precisely accurate in training. If good enough is good enough in training, then good enough is good enough in working. And everything goes downhill from there in many cases. There's very few technicians that get a whole lot better after maybe 5 or 10 years in the business. They pretty much have learned, and they pretty much have established what they know, what their knowledge is. And that's the type of case that they turn out. You can tell by looking at a crown at any given time from Bob that it's Bob's crown, or Julie's crown, or Terry's crown. You know that because that's the way they do it. That's an unfortunate thing, because sometimes doctors say, I only want Bob to make my teeth. I only want Julie to make mine. And that's not a good thing for a laboratory. That's a laboratory that basically does not have an anatomy standard. And so they're operating on individual technicians doing individual work, pleasing individual doctors, which becomes quite a burden on the laboratory. So I'm going to do some more teeth. Let's go back and look at that. Where I've drawn that anatomy, now compare it to what I'm going to show you now. It almost is very close to a duplicate. There isn't an attempt here to make an exact copy of this tooth, but you could see that the pieces and parts are precisely in the same place. That's what we're going after. So if someone would have carved this tooth or would have designed this tooth using particular library, PTC happens to have 4 libraries that go into the 3Shape system, I can make a judgment call based on, does it look like that? If has some type of anomaly to it, or it's a little bit different, I'm always going to be thinking of this tooth. And then based on, well, what did you have to do as an exception to get the anatomy that is required by this particular case? And it's always just a small move in one direction or another. These grooves that I said always start in the pit and stop just shy of the occlusal perimeter. It's quite simple. Do they always do that? On a worn tooth, can I make it shorter? Could I make it longer? Could I make it more angled? Could I make it not quite 45 degrees? I could do all of those things, but I couldn't even think about that unless I had a stable reference saying more or less than 45 degrees, not quite midway between the crest of the ridge and an adjacent groove. Until you have that standard in the mind of your technicians, then they don't have the ability to have sound opinion and judgment about the case that they're working on. So we can stop here and answer any questions there might be, or I can move on and show you that those same concepts apply to every tooth that you're going to encounter.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in yet, however, so we can keep going, but I do just want to comment that, this is fun for me, and very I don't know the right nostalgic maybe, because I'm a technician, before Whitmix, and seeing all of these images just takes me back to when I was first learning the dental laboratory business, and learning that anatomy and waxing up my gold crowns, and I love this. This is great. So I'd love for us to keep going a little bit. We still have almost 20 minutes.
Sure.
So I'd love for you to keep going.
Sure. We'll just go through, and this is almost like proof of the concept that it applies to any tooth, no matter. So I'll take a second and talk about this this tooth drawing. It could seem a bit superficial in the sense of, okay, well, I know how to draw a tooth, but how does that help me in design? How does that really help me if I'm building a porcelain crown or waxing or whatever, that you might be doing in any laboratory? And it's the thing of tooth anatomy has these individual parts. There are cusp tips, cusp ridges, primary grooves, secondary grooves, pits, fossae, all of those things. When you're making a tooth, you always have that. And you always have to have a consideration of, where do I put this, or where does that go? Or would this be okay, or would that be okay? When you have a stable reference, such as what we're dealing with, it removes those questions. And so you always know that a stable reference is something that is stable, doesn't change, and you always know where you are. But one thing you must know about a stable reference is that you can alter it a little bit on one side or another to create that infinite anatomy that a lot of people think that exists in all teeth. And of course it does, but it's small amounts, not big amounts. So let's talk about this. We're going to draw that line, that guideline across the buccal cusp tip. Since there's only one cusp tip here, it's basically more or less just a slightly curving line. So we're going to go through the middle of the tooth, and there we are. Why did we draw the line? Because we're going to use that as a guideline for where we're going to put our cusp tips. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to make a judgment call that that's where the beginning of this marginal ridge starts. And I'm going to go in 45 degrees. And I'll put a pit there. I'm going to start over here. This is about right where it goes. And I'm going to go 45 degrees in here. And I'm going to put a pit here. Those marginal ridges, as you'll notice on a lower first molar, don't have to be in the same place to get that pit in the correct position. And let's go back 45 degrees here. And that's where those secondary grooves are. If I'm going to, there's no other pits on there. There are 2 pits on this case. So I need to determine where I'm going to put my secondary grooves. Oh, by the way, if I only had 2 pits, I'd be drawing this central dissectional groove right here. I always miss that because it's already drawn whenever you have only 2 pits on the case. So that would have been drawn. Now I have the crest of the ridge here. This secondary groove is going to be a curving groove, It was a little bit sloppy, but I want to make sure we get through the teeth that I want to show you. Now, right here is midway between the crest of the ridge and the adjacent groove. So there's about midway, there's about midway. I'll put a curving groove here. And notice on this secondary groove, I mostly go from the pit, I mostly go out, in, and out. Now, the reason for that is because I want the base of this cusp to be broader than it is at the tip. In some schools, they teach this as triangular ridge. And PTC doesn't really talk about it much because it usually ends up being a triangular ridge anyway, so there's no point in talking about it. So this one is the same thing. Now notice that I'm just repeating everything that I said to you before. And I'm going to end up with a tooth that looks very, very similar to this. If that was a wax surface and I was carving the secondary grooves in it and the primary grooves, you'd see the same tooth. Now, this one is a little bit weird, you would think. Okay, so what are you doing in the case of this? Well, it only has 1 cusp. So I'm going to draw my guideline through the cusp tip. And I'm going to come here, midway buccolingually, and I'm going to make this line. It's not exactly straight, it's slightly curved. Purpose being is that this guideline is going to help me place my particular pits. Anytime you see where there's a groove, there is always going to be a depression. In most cases, we're going to call them pits. So I'm going to go 45 degrees in here, and I'm going to place a pit. I'm going to go 45 degrees in here and place a pit. At 45 degrees, if you did 1,000 teeth, it would still be 45 degrees would be the reference that you come from. This groove actually curves up in like this, and so it's not actually going to create another pit. So it does come up and establishes that right there. So those are all the pits that I have in this case. So how do I draw the tooth? Same thing, 45 degrees this way, 45 degrees that way, a curving S. Now, if you want sometimes a curve in and then out, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just don't do it consistently, otherwise you'll have, your cusp ridge will be almost like a cylinder. So here's my cusp ridge. I know it goes from the cusp tip to midway between 2 adjacent pits. That's such a simple thing to determine where the top of the ridge is. So if this is the top of the ridge, this is the lowest part, then my secondary groove is going to end up midway between there. So I'll make those. Let me put this groove in. Secondary groove. Secondary groove. Now notice those stable reference that I gave you for where the parts of the tooth go. I've been repeating that over and over and over. Elongated S, top of the ridge, adjacent groove, secondary groove goes right in the middle, stops just short of the occlusal perimeter. Boom. So there's the tooth that we have. It's going to be the same time after time after time. And here's one that we also might think that might change things a little bit. Nothing changes here. When a technician begins to learn this and they start doing the drawings, it may take them in the beginning, let's say, as much as 10 minutes to draw 5 teeth. The next time they draw it, it's more like 6 minutes, and then 4 minutes, and then maybe even 3 minutes after a couple of hours of testing. So there's something I want to point out here that's really interesting in the phenomenon that happens there, is that they started out not knowing. They started out questioning. And remember those slides that says, you know, can you imagine how much time is wasted by a technician that has an unknown final product in an unknown procedure? Well, when we teach this in anatomy, the technicians begin to go faster. And at the same time, they become more accurate because they have more certainty of exactly where everything goes. Now relate that to any technician that's sitting at the bench. If you want to increase productivity, how do you do that? You eliminate hesitation. You eliminate that technician that's stopping and looking at their case all the time and blowing on it and licking it or whatever it is that they do. And if you watch them and see how many times they do that, you'll understand that every hesitation extends the time that it takes to create that crown. Why are they hesitating? They're hesitating because they don't know. They don't know the next step. They don't know the next procedure. They don't know the next shape. They don't know the next thing to do. So what you get after a hesitation is an approximation. Well, I think it should go here. There's really no certainty in it. That's a formula for mediocrity. I could just simply say it, and I hold it to be an absolute truth, is that technicians that are not certain about what the objective is and what the procedure is to get it are almost destined to be an average technician. They don't have much of an option. As a dental laboratory owner, you can certainly change that. Here we're going to create this other guideline that's going to be parallel to the other one. The fact that it's close to those grooves really is kind of incidental in this case. So now we're going to go again, 45 degrees in, make this pit. 45 degrees to the other side, exactly the same thing that we've been talking about all along. This groove comes up here, and I'm going to stop just short of the line. That enables me to create my central dissectional groove. And that central dissectional groove is going to drop down here, go up here, and back out again. Lingual groove is going to come right up here and meet with that central dissectional groove line. Typically, I'd like to erase that, but I can't do it with this program. So this is my primary anatomy. Next thing I'm going to do is simply create the secondary anatomy. Secondary anatomy is divided into 2 parts. This is something that PTC does for clarity, and I think it really is a solid concept. Marginal ridge grooves are exactly the same on every tooth that you make, so why not differentiate them from a cusp ridge groove? That marginal ridge groove goes back in an elongated S at 45 degrees to the marginal ridge. Again, go here, here, and now we're going to do the cusp ridge grooves. What guideline do we need to do a cusp ridge groove? We need to know where the cusp ridge is. So the top of the ridge is right here. It always goes from the cusp tip to midway between 2 adjacent pits, this one and that one. That's kind of a given in this case. Now, the last tooth we're going to do is going to be the lower first molar, and you'll see that there's an interesting concept there. Now I have all my guidelines. What am I going to do? It's just too simple. Put it here, put it here, put it there, put it there. Notice I can go, as I'm teaching this, I can go faster because you guys are hearing the same thing, guys and gals. You're hearing the same thing and you're seeing the same thing. So I'm operating on stable references that ultimately become the fundamental concepts of how you design a tooth. There it is. Now, if we bring it up, that's the tooth that we just drew. If I say this is the top of the ridge and this is the adjacent groove, this cusp tip is going to be very close to being right there. Now, on this tooth, the way it was carved probably 40 years ago, it goes in a tiny bit more. Okay, well, if it's not exactly there, is it okay to do that? That starts to become the artistry and the signature of the technician, let's say. But we know it when we see it. Okay, here's the last tooth, and we're pretty much getting close to the time here. So let's just do this one. And for most technicians, this is the most difficult one. And it's going to go like this. Notice how this curves fairly dramatically. So this central groove guideline is going to have to be parallel to that, and it's going to curve the same way. Parallel means the same distance from one line to the other, equidistant. What is this guideline for? It's to help us properly position where the pits are. The pits are the driving force of the occlusal anatomy, so we first have to establish them. We go to the beginning of the cusp ridge, 45 degrees in, make a pit. Notice this marginal ridge is considerably smaller than this one in length. It doesn't concern me because my stable references go from the beginning of the marginal ridge, go in 45 degrees and make a pit. Next rule of thumb, our stable reference is I have a buccal groove. I'm going to go in straight in and I'm going to stop just short of the line and I'll make a pit there, depression, and I'll come from the lingual straight up and I'll make a depression right here. And that's going to be another pit. This particular one, on molars, on the distal, you have a small cusp. That dissectional groove is angled toward the distal, and this one on the lower is angled toward the mesial. But I'm going to go follow it in right here and make another depression right there. So I have where my pits go. I'm simply going to draw my dissectional groove, central dissectional groove from one pit to the other. This is just a connect the dots situation. That's a properly designed central dissectional groove. Here's my buccal groove. Here's my lingual groove, distal groove. I have cusps, primary anatomy. Secondary anatomy divided into two sections. We're going to do the marginal ridge grooves first. We're going 45 degrees back, right where we came from, and we're going to form these marginal ridges. Cusp ridge, the top of the cusp ridge is going to be midway between these 2 points. Now, which points do you use? Here's 2 points over here. The closest ones that are on the same side of the guideline. So this one's on that side on the buccal, this one's on the buccal, and you can always use the mesial and distal pits that are always on the line. So I'm going to use these two. I didn't go exactly right in the middle there, but so again, this can be a little bit boring whenever you just see the same thing done over and over again. Now, keep in mind, I use these 2 pits. For this one, I'm of course going to use these 2 pits going from the cusp tip. Now I'm on the lingual, so I'll use this lingual pit and the distal pit. Midway between there is about right there. On this lingual cusp, I'm also going to use this, and that's not exactly the same place that one is. It's more like right here. And so I'll go this way. And notice, just because we use these guidelines, all of these cusp ridges are oblique. They're at an angle to the central groove. Now, I don't have to go back and do this. If you're training this, you'll want to do that. But typically, this can be on maybe the 10th try, you can say, I know where the middle of that goes. It's right there. Middle of this goes right there. Right here. Right here. If there is a groove in the area where you might put a secondary groove, let's say this marginal ridge groove, why would I do that? I'm just going to leave it right there. I do have space for this one. You can always come up a dissectional groove a little ways when you're making a secondary groove if you need just a little bit more space for it. In this case, we didn't, but I did it anyway. And okay, that's the anatomy for that lower first molar. It's, if you follow the rules that we set out, you're always going to make it the same. What I want to point out is, see this right here? That's where virtually all the information is of everything that I just told you. This is a fundamental. This concept that is included in this cusp right here, the quadrant of this tooth, is almost everything you need to know. If you understand everything here, then you understand every tooth that you're ever going to carve, ever going to design, ever going to build. Looks like that. All right, looks like we're pretty much out of time. There's all the examples of the teeth that we drew and designed. I hope that gives you, everybody listening, I hope it gives you a good concept of what it means to establish a standard and how important it is to get to the precisely defined objective of that standard so you can hold people accountable and QC it properly. Awesome.
Jim, we do have one question that came in, and it's a very good one. And I think this is probably something that a lot of labs probably run into. The question is, how do you introduce the PTC anatomy to a lab of 5 techs that have been using many different anatomies until this new manager comes in and wants to, implement a PTC standard anatomy? How does that conversation go? Do you have any tips or advice for that?
Bryce, that's probably the #1 question that I get at PTC. And so it really is a good question, and there's a real simple answer for it. I mean, without trying to sell something on here, I have to tell you what I believe to be true. You ask about PTC, is that PTC has online anatomy courses. There are 4 of them. One of them happens to be posterior anatomy. It's the beginning of creating a stable reference for all of your technicians. My recommendation is that you put everyone through that with the purpose of understanding is that, guys, we're really trying, this is the beginnings of trying to establish a stable reference for our anatomy. And this is where we're going to go. We also have a booklet that comes with that that's called an online workbook. All these things have to be purchased, obviously. It amounts to about $100 per technician. If then you have a trainer or a supervisor that can take that person after they finished with the online course through the workbook and verify that they know precisely and exactly what they need to know, that's where you start. That's where you get everybody on the same page, understanding clearly what this anatomy standard is about. Now, the only thing left is managing it, reinforcing it, making sure that it's done. And if you have anatomy standard, you make it clearly known by all of the technicians and you enforce it, that's the whole game.
Gotcha. Great answer. Perfect. That's the only question, although a very good one. That's the only question we had come in. So that's all I've got. I want to extend a huge thank you to you, Jim. This was an awesome presentation, and I think very valuable and needed. So I do want to reiterate, keep an eye out for that email about your CE credits. And just follow the instructions in that email to obtain those. And again, this is recorded, so you can go back and watch this either on our website, on our Facebook page, and it will more than likely also be on our YouTube channel. Thank you, everybody that attended today. And again, thank you, Jim.
Great. Thanks, Bryce. Thanks very much. Thanks for Whitmix.
Awesome. Bye, everyone.
Mm-hmm.